For the first time since early in 2025, Russia has again used the Oreshnik missile. As you may recall, when we had MIT professor Ted Postel on, we have shown that there is no defense on the western side to the Oreshnik missile. You can see some of the video that has come in from Ukraine overnight, showing some of it on your screen right now. And what you'll notice very clearly is no air defense systems going up to even attempt to intercept this. All the missiles reach their target. We don't know at this moment exactly what the result was. We don't see any explosions. And as you may know from that meeting or that presentation, that the Oreshnik missile is not a conventional missile in the sense of an explosive warhead, but the kinetic energy can send it many, many meters underground, and the kinetic heat created by that can destroy nearly anything, go through bunkers, and then detonate anything that's underneath there. So we'll have to wait and see what resulted from that. That was also in conjunction with a number of other conventional missiles and drones throughout Ukraine, especially in Kiev, as you're seeing on the picture here. It was a pretty miserable night in Kiev. We want to try to assess, though, other than just this one attack and the series, because the last couple of nights there's been two different ones. What does this mean? What does this tell us about the course of the war, especially in light of the big diplomatic foray and soiree in Paris a couple of days ago on the western side? And there is nobody better to try and ascertain what the heck is going on than our good friend Alexander Mercouris, co-host of the Duran YouTube channel, and just an all-around great guy. Alexander, welcome back to the show. Welcome to 2026.
Oh, indeed. Welcome. I'm delighted to be back here on the show. And can I just wish everybody who watches this show a very happy 2026, a very happy new year.
And of course, we wish you and your family, your lovely family, the same in return. I wonder what your thoughts were. I'll tell you, because Russia has been pounding Ukraine in the air for quite some time, and it's almost a regular occurrence when you have these drone and missile strikes throughout the country. So that by itself wasn't surprising at all. But what did surprise me a little bit was the use of the Oreshnik missile here. At this moment, I still have not been able to find conclusively what was it. There's some claims that it was some not oil, but gas storage facilities. But I haven't seen any video. I haven't seen any confirmation. But I'm thinking the Oreshnik went into serial production, into regular use, according to Putin, toward the end of last year. And one would imagine that with the limited number that they have, that they're only going to use them on really high value targets. So that made me wonder why the use of it now. And I wonder what your thoughts are.
Right. Well, the reason the Russians are giving for using it now was that this was a retaliation to the drone attack that they claim Ukraine carried out against Putin's residence in Novgorod. The attack, the Novgorod residence, which is known as Valdai. So this is the justification, the explanation the Russians are giving. And of course, we can't just disregard that. But I have to say that the Russians have been very heavily involved, as you absolutely rightly say, in conducting major missile and drone strikes across Ukraine, right across this winter. And in some respects, it's perhaps unsurprising that the Oreshnik would at some point be used in that sort of aerial offensive that they are carrying out. The question is, why did they choose to attack this place, this position precisely? Now, there is one theory which is all over the internet. I cannot confirm it, that what they were actually aiming for is a major gas storage plant which is located near the city of Lvov, where this attack took place. And allegedly, around 50% of Ukraine's natural gas is stored there. But I haven't seen any sign of that. And the one thing that does give me a certain pause, and I'm not a scientist like Ted Postel is, but I would have thought that if you're attacking a gas storage facility, if something as hot and fiery as a Mac missile heading, with 10 times the speed of light, spark sound comes in, then you would see an enormous bang and a massive fireball and explosion as all the gas burnt as a result. So there's absolutely no sign of anything like that.
Right.
So it does make me wonder what it was exactly that the Russians were going for. Obviously, there was something, and we will perhaps find out in time.
And
But
one of the things that I was speculating about, and just looking at from from a kind of geopolitical nature, and from what I've been able to ascertain from Russian behavior over many years, actually, is I wonder if it might not have been to say, all right, we're going to show you again. This Oreshnik is real. It's not just a fake. It's not just some spin. And we're going to hit this target over here because we want to make very clear to you that we can hit this target if we want to, i.e. something in Kiev, i.e. where the presidential bunker is, or any other high value target. And there is literally nothing you can do about it, as opposed to just striking that straight up. What do you think about that?
well, that's absolutely right. And of course, the key thing to say is that, of course, they've also demonstrated that they have the ability to strike targets anywhere in Ukraine, including in Western Ukraine, with devastating power. I mean, they now have this missile. It can reach anywhere, not just in Ukraine, but across continental Europe. And it can do so at incredible velocities and with very little warning. And there's no air defense that's possible against it. Now, showing that you can reach targets in Western Ukraine is important, perhaps, because on the 6th of January, Britain and France and Ukraine signed a statement of intent about deploying Western forces, European troops, to Ukraine. And they were talking, Macron said, that these troops would be stationed in Western Ukraine, far away from the front lines, and would not be in any great danger. Well, we could see that they would be in danger because the Russians have a missile system that could reach that far and could attack those troops in those locations if they chose to.
So the question is going to be now, though, is what is going to be the results of this? What is going to be the consequence? Not just of this, because obviously, as Gary was also showing you some of the video there, Kiev itself was hit again. We had somebody on a show here recently, and I've talked to some other folks that behind the scenes, they say that Kiev was already, this is more than a month ago, was only getting about 6 hours of electricity per day. Yeah. Now that it's getting much worse. Gary, if you could put that full screen up there too, because this is one of the things that the Ukrainian media this morning was saying that basically the thing has gone cold, and there's minus 10 degree heat, 10 degrees temperature centigrade right now, and it leaves residents, basically freezing. So this is certainly going to start having an effect on more people. What do you think about just the psychological effect of all these strikes, aside from their physical reaction?
Well, the psychological effect is enormous because the Ukrainian people, the people in Kiev, are being hammered night after night. They are becoming increasingly cold, and as you rightly said, sub-zero temperatures. Apparently, there are now shortages of water because water treatment plants aren't working properly any longer. The parliament building itself in Kiev, I've heard, I can't absolutely confirm it, but it seems reliable. Even that is now functioning or not functioning because it's got no power. So it is affecting, obviously, the psychological morale. And more people in Ukraine have been leaving. Remember, this is happening in the 4th year of the war. So it's something that people are starting to say to themselves, well, if this is continuing, if the war is going to continue and get worse like this, we're clearly now on a downward trajectory. The news on the battlefronts is bad, and the news in our cities is bad. And as that article that you showed briefly confirms, the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, who is an important political figure in Ukraine, is telling everybody who can in Kiev to leave. And that is also an extraordinary thing. Kiev is at risk of becoming a ghost city, a ghost capital in a country that is being hammered to pieces.
And Alexander, one would have imagined that long before this, that just the observation of the realities on the battlefield, it's the observation of the reality in the air on the offensive side from Russia to Ukraine, and on the defensive side, because Ukraine continues to try and launched a number of large-scale drone attacks into Russia, not the least of which was the one alleged on Valdai, but also on Moscow, et cetera. And most of those get shot down. So you see that the success rate is just very small from the Ukraine side to the Russian side, and obviously much greater from the Russian side to the Ukraine side. But it doesn't appear that is moving anybody on the West to say, all right, we need to really start talking about a negotiated settlement on the best terms we can get. Otherwise, there's not going to be anything left in Ukraine to negotiate with. But that doesn't seem to be happening. And in fact, here is the reaction out of from Kaya Kallas. I think she kind of missed the mark here. Gary, if you can put that one up. She's basically saying the first part is like, no kidding. Yeah. Look, Putin doesn't want peace. Russia's response to diplomatic efforts is more missiles and more destruction. This deadly pattern of large scale Russian strikes will continue unless we help Ukraine break it. And then she says, we need to dig deeper into air defense stockpiles and deliver systems to Ukraine without delay. Does she not know that we don't have any air defense systems that can even stop the Oreshnik, and we don't have enough even for the Standard? Otherwise, we would already have given them. What do you make of that statement?
Well, it is exactly what you would expect from Kaya Kallas. She is incapable of accepting the idea that there needs to be negotiations with the Russians. She's incapable of accepting any peace agreement with Russia, between Russia and Ukraine, which would not be a Ukrainian victory and a Russian defeat. She is completely oblivious to the realities, as far as I can see, on the ground, and she just will not face simple facts like the one that you just outlined, that there is no air defense system in the West that can defeat the Oreshnik. And what air defense systems we do have, and we do have air defense systems, are not available in anything like the kind of quantities that would be needed to be able to provide the kind of protection that Ukraine would need if it were to continue indefinitely the war. So she just will not face those realities. She instead prefers this rhetoric because she is absolutely committed in some way or other to achieving a victory, which more and more people increasingly can see is unachievable. And by the way, can I just say this, Daniel? I mean, it's a very good point that you made just a moment ago about, the Ukrainian attacks on Russia having, well, I mean, they have some effect, but not huge effect. Well, the Russian attacks are devastating. The Russians are linking this Oreshnik strike with the attack on Putin's residence in Valdai. The point is, if the target was Valdai, not a single drone got through. They were all shot down. Putin obviously is not affected by it. There's been no damage to the building done at all, to the Valdai residence. It was a failed attack. Well, whatever the Oreshnik was hitting, it absolutely hit it. It managed to get through. And we must assume that the damage done would be devastating. There is a total disproportion in effectiveness of power. And again, that is something that Kaya Kallas and people like her don't seem to want to acknowledge.
And unfortunately, it's not just Kaya Kallas that doesn't seem to want to acknowledge these things, because we just had all of the brain trust of the European Union and NATO and all the big players on the continent met in Paris a few days back, and they want to have this big press conference and this big meeting where they're going to come to, try and close the gap between trying to find a negotiated settlement to reach a diplomatic end to this. So they say a lot of backslapping. You can see a lot of this, everybody's smiling, thumbs up and all this and hugs and all that around. Meanwhile, on the battlefield and in the air, things were continued on as they are today. But then in the aftermath of this, you had lots of really important sounding declarations, one of which was by Emmanuel Macron, talking about how there's going to be 800,000 troops in Ukraine supported on the backside.
With setting up ceasefire monitoring mechanisms to be placed under American leadership, with contributions from several states that said they were willing and able to do so, then long-term support Firstly, to Ukrainian armed forces that are and will remain in the front line. So we will have on a volunteer basis 800,000 men with training, capabilities and all the necessary resources to ensure that this army can deter any new aggression. Then we'll continue to lay the ground for the creation of a multinational force in the air, on the seas and on land to provide reassurance after the ceasefire.
So here's the story. I can't believe I'm even saying this out loud, and this is not a skit like on Saturday Night Live or some other comic show. All we're asking for, coming out of Paris, nearly the end of the fourth year of war, is a ceasefire that Russia says they'll never agree to, is 800,000 troops on the Ukraine side that Russia will never agree to. And we have all these security guarantees by the West into Ukraine, which was the almost, in one sense, the core reason why Russia went in the first place. All we're asking is Russia to change everything that they've said and that we'll get everything that we want, even though we're on the losing side. What could go wrong?
Well, what indeed can go wrong? I mean, listening to Macron, I mean, it is absolute fantasy. I mean, he is completely out of connection with reality. I mean, let's say that, Ukraine, it was agreed that Ukraine should have an army of 800,000 men. How can Ukraine field an army of 800,000 men? That is probably bigger than Ukraine's army is now. The reality of the situation in Ukraine today is the one that you showed earlier in the program. Cities in blackout, buildings being destroyed, missiles, Russian missiles pounding it from every conceivable side. And yet Macron talks about a Ukrainian army of 800,000 men in a country that is close to collapse. I mean, it is fantasy. It is absurdity. A country whose capital, the mayor of that capital, is telling its people to leave. So, I mean, that is already absurd. And as you absolutely rightly say, he simply refuses to listen to what the Russians have been saying, not just over the last 4 years, but throughout this entire crisis in Ukraine that goes back to the change of power that happened in 2014 when President Yanukovych was ousted and the policies of Ukraine changed radically from the policies that they had previously been. He just doesn't listen to the Russians, and he doesn't take into account the actual true realities, not just on the front lines, but across the whole country in Ukraine today.
And look, I want to add something to the reality that you're talking about there. Gary, if you can take a look there, I just loaded up another full screen, one that we've used before. This is the Ukrainian media talking about, this is just a couple of days ago. This is the Kiev Independent. Why effective use of manpower will define who's winning the war in 26. And they point out that huge, heavily armed, and for the most part still motivated Ukrainian army is nevertheless overstretched a task of defending more than 1,000 kilometers of the front line year in, year out. And this is the key part, against an enemy with an advantage in firepower, resources, and a seemingly endless supply of expendable assault infantry. Even if hundreds of thousands of human beings forming the long line of chain of brigades covering this front line are no longer numerous, capable, or motivated on the Ukraine side, even the most maximalist of Russia's war aims will be within reach in 2026. So they're admitting this. The Ukraine side, their own media in Kiev, is admitting this self-evident truth here, and yet you would never notice that from all the backstabbing in Paris among these leaders in these statements here. And let me add one more to it, because here's Keir Starmer ignoring all that, acting like we're going to go in with security guarantees.
Following a ceasefire, the UK and France will establish military hubs across Ukraine and build protected facilities for weapons and military equipment to support Ukraine's defensive needs. First, that we will participate in US-led monitoring and verification of any ceasefire. Second, we will support the long-time provision of armaments for Ukraine's defence. And third, we will work towards binding commitments to support Ukraine in the case of a future armed attack by Russia.
What are they talking about? This ceasefire, this security guarantees afterwards, when it's not clear that Kiev is going to survive the month, or that they're going to be able to have enough troops to even maintain this 1,000-kilometer front line. I mean, why do they keep saying this stuff in light of so many obvious public truths?
Well, it's very difficult to understand, and I wish somebody would ask them this directly, because that's one of the problems. No one in Europe ever does. I mean, you never get people from the media, for example, coming along and telling Macron and Starmer, what are you talking about? What is this nonsense that you're talking about? You're talking about a ceasefire. What ceasefire? The Russians have rejected a ceasefire. They've said this consistently. President Trump has also said that he does not believe in a ceasefire. He said that to Putin in Anchorage. He said that after he spoke with Putin on the phone back in December, that there will not be a ceasefire. And all of the other things that Starmer is talking about establishing hubs, which of course everybody knows what that means. That means military bases of some kind or other, whatever shape or form those take, having European troops in to monitor a ceasefire, which the Americans are going to lead. All of this is things that the Russians have rejected. And of course, the Russians consistently said, they said yesterday, by the way, the Russian Foreign Ministry published a stinging statement about the whole meeting in Paris, in which they said that for the Russians, what needs to happen is that there has to be a neutral, non-aligned, disarmed, denazified, as they endlessly say, Ukraine accepting the current territorial reality.
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you say yesterday, or did you say in June 2024? Because I'm confused. It sounds like it could be either.
It was in June 2024, and the Russian Foreign Ministry reiterated it in a statement that was published either yesterday or the day before. And by the way, in that very same statement, they excoriated Starmer and Macron and referred to them as an axis of war. So there you go. That is the Russian response. It is not published anywhere in the Western media. Nobody presents that to Starmer and Macron. And that in the meantime, the actual physical reality on the ground is the one which all of those pictures that you showed us earlier in this program, well, we see them, blackouts, destruction across the country, and a Russian army that continues to advance.
Well, I want to just tag off of what you just said, because as it turns out, I didn't have that one you're talking about from the foreign ministry, but I do have this one from today in the Russian media on, I think it's called, at least the headline was posted on something called Military Review in Russian, which I've translated with Google Translate. And they're saying, look, you talk about this axis of war or something like that. That's being mirrored in some of the others. This one here says that there could be, if we go down this path that they're talking in Paris, we could end up with World War III. Gary, if you could put that first full screen up there, because they address both those things that the two leaders just said there. Now, that one right there. You see the title, Why a Peace Deal on Ukraine Could Turn into World War III, the one they're talking about in Paris. Having received the finger, Ukraine and the Western partners behind it are now ready to gnaw off the hand of friendship extended to them from Moscow. Now, that's in the eye of the beholder, of course. Moscow saying that they've been willing to talk this whole time, and they go back to June 2024 or April 2022, take your pick. If the original versions of the Istanbul agreements in April 2022 assumed restrictions on the number of the armed forces of Ukraine at 85,000 people, and Kiev insisted on 250,000. Apparently, that's where the negotiations were at that time. Now they're asking for 100,000 service members of the armed forces of Ukraine. And the number of National Guard troops are set there. You know, I got a question for you. That 800,000 number, that is interesting, because Trump's initial 28-point peace plan, which he at least floated, I think it was in November of last year, had 600,000, which by itself was, you know, almost triple what the Russians would agree. Well, it was more than triple. Mm-hmm. But then when it came out after the refinement and after all this cooperation with Moscow, with Washington and Brussels and Kiev, then it was bumped up to another 200,000. Why do you suppose they would go from 600,000 to 800,000 unless, I fear, it was intended to be a poison pill to make sure there would be no negotiations. What do you think?
Well, I think that is probably true, and I think that is probably the objective. We've discussed this in many programs. I think that there is enormous fear and worry in Europe that the Americans and the Russians will come to some kind of understanding with each other, not just about Ukraine, but about all kinds of other things. I think the Europeans are deeply uncomfortable about a negotiation between the Americans and the Russians, and they want to do everything they possibly can to make that negotiation fail. But at the same time, I also think that they want the war to continue because they still believe in some form or other that if the war continues, they will be successful. They believe that the Russian economy will collapse, that Russia will run out of men, the Russian army will break down. They look at the fact that the Russian government has issued some OFZs, these are bonds, on the Russian financial market. So they say that Russia's budget deficit is in crisis. They look at the situation with Russian oil exports. They cherry pick data about all of these things. They don't look at the overall situation in the economy. They believe, as you pointed out to me in a program we did a short time ago, in the very exaggerated claims about Russian losses on the battlefronts. And I suspect at some level they still think if we could keep this thing from ending in a peace settlement, ultimately Russia will lose and we will come out stronger. And
Alexander, I'm sorry. Let me ask you something, because that one of the things you just said there, it's kind of odd to me. This hope, because you said there are genuinely some economic markers that are not good from the Russian perspective, and they, whatever it's the bonds or inflation or several other things, that some things look like they're in trouble or that they're problems anyway. And so the idea is, okay, well, let's just exacerbate that and let some time go so it'll get worse. Two things I want to ask you based on your knowledge, both of Russian history and of European situation. One is, do you think that if those things were carried far enough, and we'll just use a 1-year time frame, and let's say that they all continued to go bad, would that cause a serious crisis in the Russian economy? Would that cause them to withdraw their support from fighting the war, or would it cause them to actually withdraw? Do you think that that is a legitimate possibility?
No, I don't think it is. First of all, I don't think these problems are anything like as enormous or important and as significant as some people in the West believe. They cherry pick, as I said, information coming from within the Russian economy, and they focus on the few things that point to the downside, and they ignore the other things that might alternatively point to the upside. So that's what they do. But even if there was a significant recession in Russia this year or next year, it would not be enough by itself to cause the Russians to change their objectives or their approach to the war. It is something that not just Putin, but Russian society altogether is fully committed to. And anybody who thinks otherwise is simply ignorant of the situation there. That, by the way, is another reality that people in Europe, in the West, simply cannot face.
And let me ask you the corollary to that. While you're cherry picking economic data that is genuine, at least at face value, and then projecting things that I think are unrealistic, that does not take away from the Western side, which also has a lot of negative economic indicators and potential problems on the horizon. And you're talking about a rearm Europe, and you're talking everybody go up to 5% of GDP on their own military, turning this maybe even into some kind of Cold War, which will cost a lot of money, possibly getting ready for a war. That's going to cost a lot of money. And can the Western economy do that over the next year or two?
Well, absolutely. I think you're making an absolutely correct point, because of course the Russian economy has problems. Every economy always has problems. And no doubt there are particular problems and stresses caused by this war. But we are suffering problems and stresses of the same kind, only to a much more visible and greater degree. Living standards in Russia have been growing over the last 4 years. They're still rising. Living standards in Europe have been falling. That perhaps is more indicative than anything else of the true direction of travel on the economic side. But people do pick data. They look for things that will confirm their opinion that things on the other side are going bad in order to rationalize their already predisposition, which is to continue the war, because they say to themselves, if we could continue the war long enough and far enough, we will get what we want, ignoring all the realities, both in Ukraine itself and in Europe and amongst European societies, which are getting worse all the time.
That's just as you say, something that is just we just don't talk about. We don't like to consider it.
No.
But the leaders are the ones who are going to be responsible and culpable if these bad things start happening economically at home, and they'll pay the electoral price if it goes. So one would think they have some self-interest in starting to do some of this, and maybe there is some movement in that. Everybody is not impervious to that kind of power. I'm going to take a look at a couple here. By the way, I just want to announce to everybody who's watching right now that we're going to have a special replay of Ted Postal's Russian Oreshnik missile, what it's all about. Obviously, because that's in the news today, we're going to replay that one at 12:30 p.m. today, so everybody gets a chance to watch that. We mentioned it a second ago. Really highly recommend you tune in for this one, because it is very, very fascinating. So just want to point that out. Others who may be paying some attention to some of this, first of all, is Friedrich Merz from Germany. So after all of the pomp and circumstances of Paris, after all the press conferences have been made, to include some of his own statements, the next day back in Germany, he put a little bit of dose of realism in it when he noted this.
Die Reihenfolge muss sein, erst ein Waffenstillstand, dann Sicherheitsgarantien für die Ukraine, für ein langfristiges Abkommen mit Russland. Und das Ganze geht eben nicht ohne die Zustimmung Russlands, und von der sind wir vermutlich immer noch ziemlich weit entfernt.
So he says all this, it has to be a ceasefire first, which Russia has rejected, and then all the security guarantees. But we first have to get together with Russia. Otherwise, and we're probably a long way from that. So at least he's putting in a little bit of honesty there. What do you make about him saying that the day after Paris?
Well, why did he go to Paris at all then? I mean, why, if the Russians have a veto over this process, which in fact they have been applying consistently for 4 years now? I mean, they've repeatedly rejected all of these proposals. Why repeat the same proposals that we have made many times before and which the Russians have consistently rejected? Why go through this whole circus all over again? Why not do something altogether more productive, which is to pick up the telephone, talk to Vladimir Putin, maybe meet him and see exactly what this person wants and see whether there's any way of coming to a compromise? Because what Merz has just done is admit that whole meeting in Paris was a lot of hot air that amounted to nothing. I mean, I in some ways, I too am grateful for that glimmer of honesty from him. But I also remain incredulous that so much time is wasted with people basically negotiating with each other, coming constantly up with proposals, which the other side, the side that really matters in this conflict, is not consulted about, and which it has publicly and consistently already rejected.
And and all this stuff, I mean, this is like, some kind of a Yalta statement and signing when everybody's all this important. It really looks good. All again, happiness and smiles, literally nothing, no substance whatsoever. Now, one person you don't see at that table right there is Meloni from Italy. And she, I think it was just today, she said something even more than Merz did. And she's kind of like, I'm kind of reading between the lines. You're going to see what she says here in a second is still kind of polite to Europe. But as I read this, she's really saying, boys, it's time to start acknowledging reality. How do you see it? Watch.
È arrivato il momento in cui anche l'Europa parli con la Russia. Perché se l'Europa decide di partecipare a questa fase di negoziazioni parlando solo con una delle due parti in campo, temo che alla fine vedrà diciamo, il contributo positivo che può portare sia limitato. Dopodiché però dov'è il problema di questo? Il problema di questo è chi lo deve fare, perché se noi facessimo l'errore di, diciamo, decidere da una parte di riaprire le interlocuzioni con la Russia e dall'altra di andare in ordine sparso mentre lo facciamo, noi faremo un favore a Putin. E l'ultima cosa che voglio fare io nella vita è un favore a Putin.
Sure, I don't want to do Putin any favors, but fellas, it is time to start recognizing you can't solve this without talking to one of the parties. She could have been one. Maybe she did watch your show. I don't know.
Well, all I will say is it is a huge step forward, because at last one European leader from one of the big countries, which is Italy. Italy is a big country. It's an important player in Europe, has come out and said the obvious. Now, it's taken them 4 years to get there, but at least we should be grateful that at least one of them has finally done this. Now, I hope that she follows through with this. If she's going to wait for Macron, Merz, Starmer, and the European Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, to agree, then she will find, I'm afraid, that she will be waiting forever. The best thing for her to do is obviously to speak with them first, tell them what she's going to do, and then see whether she can get on a plane and meet with Putin somewhere. It doesn't have to be in Moscow. Maybe they can do it in Istanbul or someplace else, and see exactly what way forward there is. Because obviously what she says is completely right. It is entirely true. Certainly I've been saying it, but so have you, Daniel, for as long as I have been.
And I honestly, I mean, it's like diplomacy 101, like the opening day of diplomacy 101. It's self-evident beyond compare that you can't have a negotiated settlement between two sides unless you're talking to both sides. And yet we have adamantly not done that. I guess probably the reason in the past has just been because, no, we can outlast them. I think a lot of people on the Western side actually believe, no, we can outlast them. We just got to, Russia's getting hurt by this. Yeah, Ukraine is too. But if we drag this out long enough, eventually, because I think that, and this is, I like your view on this, I think maybe there's been some projection. If this was happening to me, I could be worn down. And I would get tired of this, because if our quality of life was going down and we were suffering like this, we'd have to do something. And I mean, look, America left Vietnam after a while. They left Afghanistan after a long time. Maybe Russia will do the same thing. And because I would. Do you think that that's part of it? Or is there just a complete detachment from the West and they don't even think of that far?
No, I definitely think there is a part of it. There is an idea that you can actually outlast the Russians. In fact, they've talked about this many times. I mean, there's also a sense, that we have an economy much bigger than theirs, multiple times bigger than theirs, a far bigger population than they have. And somehow, sooner or later, in one form or another, all of that will tell, and we will outlast them, and they will run out of steam. What that completely overlooks, putting aside issues of culture and, cultures of endurance and patience and all of that, is that, but what that fails to understand is that for the Russians, Ukraine is an existential issue, or at least that is what they sincerely believe. And they are going to make sacrifices for something that is existentially important to them, that they believe is vital for the long-term survival of their country, which they might not be prepared to make in another war, in another place, like, say, Afghanistan in the 1980s or something like that. So this is something that people do need to grapple with, that there is much greater will and, as a result, far greater staying power on the other side, because they see this as so important to themselves.
I wanted to ask you, which is kind of a related situation here, especially in the UK, and really all of Europe. And of course, that is Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner were at that meeting in Paris. So the U.S. at a relatively high level, at least high to President Trump, was present at that. One can imagine that they were looking at ways to make more money by whatever comes out of it, but it didn't seem to have much of an impact on anything one way or the other. But President Trump is not just worried about trying to negotiate something with Russia. There's a few other things going on in the world, as you may have heard. This little thing in Venezuela, we may talk about that in a second. But the other thing that is very much on the minds of most Europeans is they're trying to grapple with this. And one of the things that Keir Starmer was asked on the parliament floor earlier this week was, hey, what about what Trump's trying to do to Greenland? He might take it. Are you going to say anything about it? And Keir Starmer at that time says, you know what? We're prioritizing getting some kind of an agreement on the Russia-Ukraine situation. But then he was asked, Gary, if you can play the one called Starmer Today 1, this is what he said on Greenland.
The future of Greenland is for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, and for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone. And yesterday, he will have seen that I put out a statement to that effect, along with fellow allies in Europe. And of course, NATO is hugely important, the single most effective and important military alliance the world has ever known. He keeps encouraging me to sort of tug away at parts of NATO and to choose between Europe and the US. That would be a strategic mistake for our country. And yesterday we were working with our NATO allies, including the US, our NATO ally, on a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. That will not happen without security guarantees from the coalition of the willing, backed by the United States.
Yeah, Alexander, it's not going to happen with or without anything from the United States. Surely Keir Starmer and his staff understand that Trump will never provide security guarantees in the way he's thinking of them, like boots on the ground or a military response to Kiev. He'll never do that. So there's not going to be any of that. So it seems to me he's saying, I'm going to prioritize trying to keep America on board for that, which is not going to happen. And I'm not going to challenge him on this potential issue in Greenland, which Trump shows he's volatile enough to actually try and take Greenland by force. What do you make of what's going on in UK politics right now?
Well, I get it so straightforwardly. The British talk about appeasement all the time. This is appeasement is one of the words that you read every day in the British media, conjuring up the ghosts of Munich, 1938 and all of that. What we saw from Keir Starmer in the House of Commons is actual appeasement, because he's going to he gives every sign that if it comes down to it, Ukraine and this elaborate plan that he's put together, which, as you rightly say, is never going to happen, that is more important to him in the end than taking a strong line over Greenland, saying straightforwardly and publicly that any American attempt to take control of Greenland is unacceptable, that the United Kingdom will oppose it. Doesn't mean that we are looking to be enemies of the United States or anything of that kind, but this is clearly wrong. He's not prepared to use that kind of forthright language because he wants to get the Americans on side with his plan over Ukraine, which is never going to happen. And that is appeasement.
Well, and when you're talking about having to make good on that and having to challenge the United States on that, could result in UK troops on the ground. If he succeeded, it could result in UK troops on the ground inside of Ukraine. And we already know what Russia's position on that is. We've already mentioned what it was. But they were also in that same meeting in Parliament, there was a lot of consternation in some of the members of Parliament against the possibility of putting UK troops on the ground. Gary, if you can play Starmer Today 2, here's what he had to say on that.
Mr. Speaker, let me be very clear about what was agreed yesterday, because military plans were drawn up some months ago, and I've updated the House in relation to that. Yesterday was a political declaration that sits under those military plans. If there were to be deployment, there would have to be a legal instrument. Mr. Speaker, deployment would only be after a ceasefire to support Ukraine's capabilities, to conduct deterrent operations, and to construct and protect military hubs. Mr. Speaker, there will be a statement to the House at the earliest opportunity. there could hardly be an opportunity. They claim they want to know about this, and they're trying to shout me down. Mr. Speaker, in relation to the House, if there were a decision to deploy under the agreement that was signed yesterday, then I would put that matter to this House.
So to me, what he's saying there is like, look, forget about what I agreed to in Paris. That will never happen unless all of these other things happen, and they're not going to happen. But, don't say anything about it here. So it seems to me there's two things. Tell me your view. One, he's basically admitting that nothing happened in Paris at all. There's not any agreement to. And number two, that if I ever put British troops on the ground in Ukraine, everybody knows they would be a target. And so there's a lot of opposition to that inside the parliament. Is there also opposition inside of UK to that?
Well, absolutely there is. I mean, there's no question at all about this. I mean, first of all, I should say there's opposition in the military to this. Many people in the military are not keen on this idea at all. There's been opposition about this in the media. There's a writer, Edward Lucas, in the Times, who is a staunch supporter of Ukraine and a critic of Vladimir Putin's. Anyway, he's written to say, we're proposing to put troops we don't have to enforce a ceasefire that doesn't exist into a country that, well, we know its condition, in reliance upon guarantees from a superpower, reliance of guarantees which will never come. And that is what Starmer is proposing. So yes, absolutely, there is a lot of opposition, probably not enough in Parliament, where there is a very strong support for, well, Starmer has a very big parliamentary majority. But in the country, the wider country, and within the military itself, there is a huge amount of opposition. And can I just add to your point? You said that what happened, what Starmer is basically telling us, is that the meeting in Paris really didn't decide anything. Absolutely. He says so himself. He says this is a political declaration. The actual military decision was taken a long time ago. So again, coming back to the question, what in that case was that the purpose of that meeting in Paris? They're just saying the same thing again and again and again. They're still talking about ceasefires that the Russians, who have a veto over the matter, as Merz has said, as Maloney is saying, as Starmer himself said. He said that there has to be a legal agreement first. A legal agreement is one that the Russians have to agree to. They have a veto of that over this matter. They're in a position to enforce that veto. And they are saying no.
That's how I read it. That's how it seems like a lot of people read it here. And, one other question off of that. What is the political risk that Keir Starmer endures or exemplifies by keeping going down this path of unrealistic? Because it seems to me that you keep making even these high flourishing rhetorical statements of what you would like to see someday, knowing that it will never happen, and it won't happen. And then when you look on the battlefield, and I'm going to touch on this in a second, the likelihood is that as the Kiev Independent itself questioned, 2026 may not see the Ukraine army be in a coherent force by the end of the year. They may not make it through this year. And if that happens, then where is that going to leave Keir Starmer? Because then they're going to look back and they're going to say, since the day you assumed office, you've been saying all this coalition of the willing and just and lasting peace, which he repeated there. And none of that ever happened. And now then we can see people like Alexander Mercouris or several other people have been saying there was never a possibility for that. And then they may justly say, why did you not know that? And why did you pursue something that was unattainable? What political consequence could that have for him?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, up to now, there's been a great unwillingness in Britain to actually grapple with the realities of this conflict and what is going on there. But I think if we get to the position that you describe, a situation where there is a military crisis in Ukraine, where Ukraine visibly cannot go on, and we end up in a situation where the Russians are not only in a position to dictate terms, but dictate terms which are going to be significantly harsher than the ones that we are seeing at the moment, then it is all but impossible to see how Starmer himself is not going to suffer major political damage. It is not as if he is popular anyway. In fact, he is deeply unpopular. And already there is criticism of him that he is giving far too much time to foreign policy and specifically to Ukraine. It will have seen that he has failed and been completely wrong over the single thing that he cared most about. And I can't see him surviving as prime minister beyond it.
Well, and speaking of not surviving, you just saw that headline Gary put up there where Klitschko, I think, as you mentioned earlier in this episode here, is saying it's time to leave Kiev. When you see that you can't even keep the lights on in your capital city, when you see that your media is openly questioning whether you'll have enough men to even survive the year, when you see the Oreshnik missile being used in the eastern or the western part of the country, when you see the front line continuing to erode and move to the west on a daily basis, and then on the other side of that line, you see the Russians continuing to increase in their capacity, manpower, economic capacity, production capacity. And then, like you see on the screen again there, these Oreshnik missiles against which you have literally no defense. Where do you see this war going? And we'll just say in the next 3 months.
Well, I have to say, this bitter thought though it is, I don't think we're going to see a negotiated resolution of this conflict in the next 3 months. I think that there will still be talks between the United States and Russia. I don't think we're anywhere close to any kind of agreement, because just as the Russians have a veto over an agreement, so unfortunately it seems do people like Starmer and Macron and Ursula von der Leyen, and of course Zelensky himself, and they don't seem to be willing to make the key compromises. So I think that what we will probably see is more disaster and destruction in Ukraine, a real risk that Kiev itself and the other cities will become ghost cities, a progressive collapse of the Ukrainian economy, and an increasing crisis on the front lines. And then at some point, what you say will probably come true. There will come that realization that things are now approaching or have reached the point of no return. And then finally, they will start to listen to people like Meloni and others like you and me, because Meloni is only saying what we've all been saying for all this time. And then there will be a mad rush and scramble, perhaps to Moscow, hopefully to Moscow, to see what can be patched together and what can be done. But at that point, the Russians will be in a very much stronger position than they have been at any point before, and probably they will not be in any mood to give away very much. So that is where I see this going. In the meantime, thousands of people will die. People in all of these cities will be left with without light and water and heat. Many of them will have been forced to leave their homes. The tragedy of Ukraine, which should never be forgotten, will get much, much worse. And on the front lines, more people will die.
Well, I would love to argue any of those points with you. I can't. And it's just an incredible tragedy for the people of Ukraine that the people and the leaders of the West have been adamantly unwilling. And we can certainly go back into the Biden administration and add them all to that list. And even currently the Trump administration, frankly, because he's not done anything to end this or to pull any strings on the Western side. Bottom line is we have been content to just let this meander forward. And the cost to the Ukraine people has been permanent and catastrophic. I just hope that something can happen before too much more of that goes on, but we'll have to wait and see. In any case, we are incredibly grateful for you coming on today to provide such clarity as you just did here, because I think you really laid it out in stark and concise detail where we are and what the problems are here. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Daniel, and I look forward to our next program together. Just to say.
Always look forward to that too. And just to let you guys know, to repeat, this whole issue of the Oreshnik missile being used today is we're going to replay Ted Postal's incredible examination of what the Russian Oreshnik missile is, what it can do, and why we can't intercept it. This is so important. Certainly recommend you watch that. It'll re-air today at 12:30 p.m. here on this channel. And do share that because, folks, this is something that people need to know about. We are on podcasts and stuff, especially if you have friends that don't really watch a lot of video. Share with them the podcast that we have here because you can get it on podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify Podcast Addict, etc. Anywhere you get podcasts, you can get this. Send this link to them. We're also on Substack, DanielDavisDeepDive.substack.com. Any way that people need to get information, now is the time to get them the truth. I promise you, folks, you're not seeing this level of honest analysis on almost any mainstream media outlet. You're going to get it here. We are unintimidated, uncompromised to bring you the truth no matter what it is. Share that with your friends today. Thank you very much, folks, and we'll see you this afternoon on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. You know, I don't try to talk you into buying gold or tell you how to run your stock portfolio, but there is a way you can help us. Subscribe, hit that like button, and share this with somebody you love.